as ultimately there were multiple different combat operations unfolding throughout the Fort Hood and vicinity battle now underway, with the Russian combat engineers and mechanized infantry battalions having had fought their way through West Fort Hood to clear the Robert Gray Army Airfield in tandem with earlier or initial Chinese strikes into West Fort Hood having cleared its southernmost portion before striking north and deep into the installation, along with Russian heavy armored formations from their 16th Tank Division in the form of 4 armored battalions and 4 armored infantry, or essentially mechanized infantry battalions, along with 4 support battalions from the 105th Logistical Support Brigade following behind them to provide them logistical support as they struck deep into the installation as well, along with the Chinese Armored and Combat Engineer battalions from the 112th Combined Arms Brigade of the PLA 68th Group Army, a reserve group army of the PLA from its enormous ready reserve forces, likewise striking inland to go for the actual armed American units that were training at the time that the tandem anti-satellite strikes and cyber attack were thus carried out. As this was all underway, within the first initial 2 hours, going on the second official hour, or 2 a.m., which would lead into the third hour between 2 and 3 a.m., the forces of the 17th Armored Brigade of the PLA 68th Group Army had already by this point sent in one of its armored battalions to methodically go down the streets of Temple, clearing it of every last form of armed resistance, as Temple lay immediately adjacent to I-35, a critically important main invasion route of the Group Army prong of external invasion forces of Group Armies 7 through 13, now at the border fighting in Laredo and about to proceed up I-35 upon the conclusion of that battle that was occurring simultaneously to this and many others. As this armored battalion was beginning to engage armed civilians, they began herding them methodically into pockets which would be far more manageable and easier to deal with, as its armored infantry companies and tank companies, anti-tank company, a single company of anti-tank forces, and headquarters company, all comprising this battalion, were engaged in different capacities in the clearing of the city, with the armored infantry companies being used to clear out buildings while they received heavy fire support from the tanks, from the tank companies within the battalion as well, as there were 4 tank companies, 2 armored infantry companies, an anti-tank company, and the headquarters company, which was the command elements as well as responsible for many of the logistical activities of the battalion itself. The headquarters battalion over the entire 17th Armored Brigade had also moved into the city, leaving one of its companies behind to manage a CCP supply property that would be later used by external forces moving up to establish a sort of bivouac and logistical area within the city to add additional support to these combat forces that were now herding armed civilians deep into the city, albeit adjacent to I-35, where they would be surrounded and destroyed by the different companies comprising this armored battalion. Even as this was going on, the Special Operations Forces between 1 and 2 a.m. were now, after having a successful operation to nab the highest value individual on the American side within the scope of this entire battle, the Lieutenant General, who was the de facto post commander of Fort Hood, but also the entire commander over 3 Corps, The helos had been, by this point, refueling and preparing for their next operation of the PLAAF helos to carry the Falcon Special Operations Battalion and some of its subordinate companies of that battalion, in particular, into combat at the Hood Army Airfield, or the East Airfield here, which was the home of some of 1st Cav's Aviation Brigade's subordinate battalions of helos. This action would be occurring just before the top of the hour of the second hour, or right before 2 a.m., with the same occurring in the battle in Temple right now with the armed civilians. This also occurring at exactly the same time as the heliborne operation to fly in Special Operations Forces under heavy artillery support, as well as the airfield taking severe barrage of fired cruise missiles and tactical ballistic missiles at exactly the same time, as was much of the rest of the installation as well. As 1:45 was the current time of the main portion of the Temple battle, at this battle, on this particular segment of this larger battle in the city of Temple occurring, 2 pockets had developed. A pocket in the north of approximately some nearly 200 American armed civilians, and a pocket into the south of that of approximately double the number, or about 400 total. Although this particular map segment of this larger battle only shows a small segment of the southern pocket, although it shows the entire northern pocket. As on this map here, as the armored battalion's forces had been methodically going down the streets and clearing the city, mostly ignoring unarmed civilians, and as a result, only specifically engaging armed civilians, they had trapped these armed civilians as they had total ISR domination and could see them as they moved and where they were going, and which helped them to focus and direct their attacks, herding them into 2 pockets, a northern pocket of, again, almost 200, and a southern pocket of around 400 armed civilians. These were reactionary armed civilians, as by this point, many in the city at the sight of the foreign troops had mostly already fled as refugees, or the very few that stayed were now trying to hide in their homes or other areas, and most of them have gotten off of the streets, leaving only the reactionary armed civilians running around and shooting, many of them having been cut down, leading to only just under 600 of them remaining by the time the 200 or so were rounded up in the northern pocket and the 400 or so were rounded up in the southern pocket, with other armed civilians having fled Temple entirely. The more wise or intelligent armed civilians realized that they needed to get out of the hot zone and begin to get into wilderness positions where they could begin to reorganize themselves and delegate different positions among their cohorts in order to form a more effective band of armed civilians than were these reactionary armed civilians. As in this small segment of the battle map, this is occurring in an area adjacent to I-35, as this is an exit ramp from I-35 into this part of the city of Temple, as this is a bridge over I-35 to another part of the city of Temple, which is being blocked by a tank platoon from one of the 4 tank companies. This is a headquarters platoon of one of the 4 tank companies, and this is a headquarters platoon of another of the 4 tank companies, with elements of the 4 companies present, of the tank companies of the battalion, with only one armored infantry battalion or company of the battalion present right here in their APCs and IFVs, their armored personnel carriers being Type 89A armor personnel carriers and the infantry fighting vehicles, one per combat platoon, was the ZBDO-4A. The main battle tanks of this armored brigade's armored battalions were Type 96B main battle tanks, a highly advanced main battle tank, although not quite as advanced as the Type 99A. It was definitely a very potent, very dangerous main battle tank indeed, and also very well protected. These forces were now, by this point, after having had herded these Americans, these armed reactionary civilians, into very manageable pockets, were surrounding them by having an entire tank company go down the middle of the street here in a column, with one of its platoons having broken off to block this bridge and its headquarters platoon establishing itself right here, with the armored infantry company coming down alongside it, down this main thoroughfare, this main boulevard right here, and stopping right here where this IFV's starting to turn round the corner right here. They stopped. The headquarters platoon of the armored infantry company is off the map, off to the east. There's elements of an additional armored company right here, whereby there is a full platoon and part of another platoon going down the street here. As the rest of this tank company, the other entire armored infantry company, and the anti-tank company, as well as the headquarters company, were off the map and were dealing with this larger pocket. With elements of this armored infantry company here that's on this street, one platoon of its dismounts contributing also to the battle against this bigger pocket down here. As 4 out of 8 companies were dealing with this larger pocket, with the other 4 dealing with the smaller pocket in hopes of eliminating it rapidly in order to divert all of the rest of their forces to this other pocket if it hadn't have already been defeated by the rest of the forces by that point. As this battle would be over extremely fast, it would turn out that it wouldn't even be necessary to use any additional forces used to deal with this pocket to deal with the other, as the other would be destroyed extremely rapidly, as the decision would be made to utilize the very powerful anti-tank company's HJ-10 anti-tank missiles to destroy buildings within which that many of these forces were hiding. There are no loitering munitions being utilized in this particular battle because most of those were being strictly used against military targets, as the military targets obviously took much higher priority over than civilian targets, although these armed civilians still needed to be dealt with because, again, they were within an urban area that had plenty of hiding places that was adjacent to the most important invasion route and needed to thus be dealt with, and dealt with immediately and quickly. Although the military forces were also, in a manner of speaking, adjacent to the highway, and thus most of the resources of the 17th Armored Brigade were deployed against the installation, with only its headquarters battalion and one of its handful of armored battalions deployed in the city to capture this city and hold it, because this was a medium-sized city and couldn't be left unoccupied by combat troops, so there had to be some sort of combat assets deployed here, as again, controlling all the medium and large and even smaller cities and towns along I-35 was of paramount importance. Hence the deployment of one full armored battalion to manage the city of Temple out of the 17th Armored Brigade, with the rest of its forces deployed against the installation proper. As the battle was underway in the northern pocket, as many of these activities were occurring simultaneously, the northern pocket will be gone over first. With a full tank company surrounding the northern pocket with its 20 main battle tanks within its 4 combat platoons of 5 tanks each, the headquarters platoon over here, and along with 2 tank platoons of an entirely different armored company, tank company, surrounding this pocket, there were dismount forces from 2 of the 3 available combat platoons of the armored infantry company that were moving into the area to clear these buildings. This portion of Temple itself was a mixture of hotels and commercial buildings and some apartment buildings, which were multi-storied. This building right here with a roof access point, which would be used by one of the squads clearing this building from this particular platoon of 5 squads, they would establish a fighting position facing this pocket from the 4th story of this particular commercial building right here, as this building was taller than the other 3- and 2-story buildings which encompass this particular block right here. As you can see, this is the streets, this is a sidewalk area down here. This is a parking area that goes within this particular block of buildings for this commercial area. And as you can see, this lead platoon right here dismounted its troops, all 5 squads, to begin clearing these structures right in this particular block. As that was happening, as this armored infantry platoon was tasked with assisting the cordoning armored companies of clearing these actual areas of armed civilians, this pocket right here, which consisted of 2 full blocks, 2 city blocks full of armed reactionary civilian combatants at the time, this urban warfare operation was involving some somewhat savage combat between the armored infantry and the armed reactionary civilians, although on the part of the armed reactionary civilians, they did manage to have a minor success in Molotoving a Type 96B main battle tank from high up on this multi-story apartment building roof. As within the building, as within these parentheses here shown, there are 30 civilians, armed civilians, hiding within this building inside of it, and there's more on the roof, as indicated by these here. As these on the roof were being fired up at by the turret gunners on the tanks, and they did manage to throw their Molotovs down and get this Type 96B right here, from which its crew managed to get out of alive, running to other tanks that were nearby for safety, getting up and inside of them. As that was occurring, and as this tank was ablaze, and its ammunition would eventually cook off and blow the turret off the top of the tank and leave the rest of it as a smoking hulk of metal, these other tanks' turret gunners in the meantime are firing up at armed civilians on top of this multi-story apartment building as well. These were some commercial buildings here and here, and there were more armed civilians that were hiding behind them, behind these buildings on either side, trying to stay out of the heavy volume of fire from these tanks. Although the tank nearest to the opening here, where vehicles could go back into this parking lot, would be firing its shells against this building, badly gutting it, as many of its floors would be exposed from having segments of wall blown out of it, as well as collapsing floors where the shells ripped into them. And this building would be blown open and exposed on this side. On this side, heavy machine gun fire and coax fire was being fired as high as the guns on the tanks could traverse, and were being fired on the different levels of the building, whether it was the second floor or first floor. But the higher up floors, as this was a 5-story apartment building, couldn't necessarily be hit except for by the turret tank gunners who could traverse and raise their heavy machine guns, their 12.7 millimeter machine guns, to hit the highest floors, and they were firing up at them. This side of the building, too, was being hit by tank shells, which was gradually gutting this structure as this tank here began to fire into the building from this side before the dismounted armored infantry platoon on this side finished clearing out this building, as well as the others moving up this street, having cleared this building earlier. As these buildings were cleared first, these exiting squads were now moving to clear other portions, other buildings within this city block, going through their back doors, as these were commercial buildings, businesses, and such. And they were going in to scale to the top floor of the highest building, which is a four-floor building right here, to begin to be able to lay fire support from the roof of this building to aid their forces that would soon be leaving, coming out the front doors of these commercial buildings to raid the buildings and reduce the pocket from this end of it, as the pocket, again, involved 2 city blocks, and this block would have to be taken by the armored infantry forces storming the buildings, and this block would be taken by the other platoon of the 3 combat platoons storming these buildings. As the third and final platoon, having exited their vehicles, were going through this area, clearing out these buildings on these 2 city blocks, this one being a hospital building, which they would actually get on to its highest floor, as this hospital had multiple floors of it. Some parts of the building were lower, like 3 stories, like this main part right here. This part was 2-story, or 2 floors, 3 floors. This highest part was 5 floors right up here, and this was the emergency entrance right here, parking lot. And armed American civilians running out of this building would be mercilessly cut down by coax tank machine gun fire from this main battle tank, although they tried to fire back at it, as indicated by the green here, indicating the tank was taking fire, being engaged, and the turret machine gunner on the 12.7 millimeter was cutting them down, as indicated by the arrow surrounded in red, as the coax and turret machine gun fire completely cut these armed civilians down as they try to run from this building across the street towards the hospital. But in the northern, smaller pocket, as these squads were maneuvering in various different tactical formations, the 2 squads on each end taking a rolling T formation, this one of the 5 already largely entering the building, as indicated by this little arrow right here. This squad by this point was already largely inside the building, as there's 3 of its members still entering, as indicated by this arrow right here. This rolling T squad was going to enter this building as well, but to clear the bottom floors of it, while the other squad was going up the stairwells to the roof to take their position on the roof. While this squad in a line formation was going in this back door, and this one was going through another back door, and this one was going into the back door of this building. Having had already cleared these buildings here, they were clearing these buildings first, and one squad going to the roof, before proceeding tactically behind the relative safety of their tanks that were out on the streets here, already laying down heavy firepower on these buildings, as indicated by the red against this building. And there were 8 armed American civilians inside this building, but this tank was firing shells directly into it, as well as heavy machine gun fire, as well as also coax fire. This building was horribly gutted by this one tank right here. As these tanks staggered their turrets to provide a 360-degree oval of protection around these two tank platoons, they staggered their turrets. One face this way, one face this way, one face this way. But as these squads moved up, they all then began to face this way, with this tank just facing towards the end. This tank manning this building, this tank having this building, this tank would eventually turn its turret as well, a bit after these squads reached these tanks. And these tanks here were being engaged, these three here, and this one at the point tank here was being engaged by armed American civilians inside of this hotel building right here. On the other side of this fence, which separated this gas station, this fence here, from the hotel and also the other buildings within this particular city block right here. As again, this was a mixed commercial area, as well as also including a hospital and apartment blocks, such as these buildings here, here, and these were all commercial. This was the hotel, as this was adjacent to the highway, and there were many hotels, motels, gas stations, and businesses along these streets right here. This street was separated by wooded and grassy partitions separating this main street right here. And as that was going on, and these different troops began to bound out of these front doors of these buildings along the street and get behind their armor for protection, by the time these 4 squads of the 5 squad platoon reached here, they kept in radio contact and also had their ISR, quadcopter reconnaissance drones, monitoring these areas to make sure that they could monitor all the movement of the armed civilians within these areas of these pockets that had been reduced into these pockets by gradually herding them into them. They now had eyes on everything that was going on in both pockets, to the south and to the north, and their troops on top of this higher ground in the form of this 4-story building here were watching over the street to give overwatch and fire support to their troops lower on the ground level, on the street level, who were now behind their tanks, and were preparing to begin to clear these buildings, even as these tanks were taking fire from the roof of this 3-story building here, but were returning fire from their turret machine gunners, as well as firing tank shells into the side of the building to eliminate anybody who might be hiding inside of it, while this entire hotel was being hit on all sides by tank shells from these tanks on the streets, firing shells into it, and would eventually be so horribly gutted, as indicated by the red on all sides of it, that almost no walls would be left standing, and much of it will have collapsed by the time the battle ended. There were approximately 30 armed civilians in this hotel building that was being shelled by tank shells. As this squad moved in to clear the gas station, before climbing the fence to clear this series of commercial buildings right here, this squad from behind the armor was laying down supporting fire against the building that would allow this squad to bound and advance inside of it, as well as this squad here from behind this tank, who was also laying down fire as these troops moved from around the tank and began to bound to the corner of this building, coordinating their movements with the troops over here that had of this platoon of 5 squads, who had just gone through methodically clearing these buildings here, and we're going in this side and then coming out, getting behind the tank. This squad in a rolling T formation here was watching the roofs, of course, and higher windows of these buildings as they ran through the parking area and entered this building to clear it before getting behind a tank, with the whole squad bounding out of the door, getting behind the tank, and putting their position here. And the same was done by this squad, having cleared this building and getting into position behind this tank here before moving to the side of it and taking position here. They would coordinate their movements with this squad here, coming out from behind their tank and laying down fire, allowing for them to move up, get to this corner, lay down fire this way until they got here, and they could fire up at American forces up here, which would allow them to move to this corner here, as they had earlier taken fire from these guys on this roof. But these guys were spotted by the troops now on the roof here, and were fired at from all the way over on the other side of this street, from the top of the 4-story building right here, firing at the 5th story of this building here, on this 5-floor apartment building. And they KIA'd these 2 guys. And as these guys were now being engaged by the troops on the roof here, they tried to run for it, which these troops on this roof made it possible, as these guys had taken some fire down here, it made it possible for this roof to be cleared, because these guys on this roof could see relatively most of the goings on this roof here, and also over here. And they were firing down at this 3-floor roof here, and were now beginning to KIA the troops over here. They'd also been cut down by some of the tank turret machine gun fire from this tank, as indicated by these 2 that were surrounded in red. And these guys here, trying to run to the other side of the building to look for who was engaging them, were cut down before they could even get to this end of the building. They were cut down on this 3-floor building over here. These 5 had to turn around and run over here to, see where the fire was coming from. But by that time, it was too late. These guys had laid down enough fire on them, and were also laying down fire on these guys on the corner, and at these guys over here that were running from this ledge, trying to get in. But before they could get farther in, as this was a floor higher than was this building, before they could get far enough in to where they could kind of like be out of line of sight, so to speak, they were cut down. So as that was happening, this squad had bounded into this building from behind the tank, as this squad was on this corner, and now began to bound into this badly gutted building, already hit by tank shells, heavy machine gun fire. They bounded in, as indicated by this arrow in green, and it's covered in green because the armed Americans that survived so far inside of this structure, that weren't completely eliminated by all the tank shells and heavy machine gun fire, were trying to fire back at some of these troops of this squad entering to clear this building. And as that was going on from around the corner, these guys were having a firefight. These 3 right here, but they were cut down in the firefight by these Chinese troops of this squad here of armored infantry. As these troops of this squad here had bounded in to clear this building out, at the same time they bounded in this building that was connected to this building to clear it. And then these guys bounded in, and they had taken a little bit of fire, but they subdued their enemies before now beginning to methodically clear this building out. And the squad that was clearing this building out was able to give support to their troops that were firing from around the corner, and fired out the windows of this gutted building. Is on this side of the building. The building was pretty badly gutted at this point. But they were on the other side of the building. They were firing out of windows at these 5 right here, which is why they're surrounded in red. They were KIA'd. And as that happened, and the shelling was getting really bad against this hotel here, these guys ran from behind this building here and were cut down from the guys firing from in the windows. And they were also firing at these guys right here, who tried to run off with the surviving guy from this group of 4 here, trying to run with them, as indicated by these two little chutes here going into this green arrow. And they were being engaged from the back, as indicated by the red on the back part of the arrow. But by the time they turned to go in, they were all cut down before they could even get into this 3-floor building here. And as by that time, again, these guys on the roof had all been KIA'd. So by that point, these 2 squads that went into these 2 connected buildings left this building to begin to clear what remained of the hotel. And they KIA'd everybody that was left in the hotel. And this squad was moved up from around the corner to clear this building out before joining up with the other 2 that were clearing this building out. And they went in this way through the back of this gutted building, and they went in through this way into the hotel before all 3 squads now moved to clear this 3-floor building here. Hence, the whole block over here was now cleared by this 1 platoon from the Armored Infantry Company that was now parked on this street. The rest of this pocket would be similarly reduced, as at the same time as this operation was occurring on this city block right here by that Armored Infantry Platoon, the other Armored Infantry Platoon in the north here, tasked with reducing this pocket from this Armored Infantry Company, as its 3rd platoon was down here working with the full entire other Armored Infantry Company, the full other tank company and anti-tank company, as well as the headquarters company commanding the whole operation of both clearing this larger pocket down here, as in more armed civilians were in the southern pocket than in this northern pocket. But up here in the north, as these forces were now entering this building at the same time as all of this was going on, these buildings were being cleared out by this squad here and this squad here, who had entered this way, this squad dismounting in a line formation, entering to clear this area, this building here, before going around and clearing out this building with this squad in a rolling T formation moving up. And they did their bounds and covers in a tactical way, with them going first, or they went first, and they went ahead and stopped at the corner of the tank. Then they went ahead in their rolling T formation to watch the roofs and higher up windows. And then they went in to clear the building. And on this side, they were bounding up before their squad split in half, 5 guarding the corner to watch the roofs as their other 5 went behind the tank first. Because these tanks were being fired at from these guys up here. And as these guys were watching the roof, they were firing up from this corner right here. They were firing up, which allowed their other 5 to run for the tank. And now they had guys behind this tank, and the guys right here that were firing up at these 2 on this roof here, which allowed for this squad to enter this building, as this squad had already entered. This squad clearing out these buildings here, and these 2 clearing out this building, had fired from windows and doors in the backs, cutting down all these armed civilians hiding back here. There was a group of 8 right here. There were 2 in this corner back in here, and there were 5 more right here. So these 3 squads that were clearing this bigger building here, and these couple smaller ones here, these were smaller businesses. This is a bigger business. These 2 squads cleared this big building. This one off here cleared these 2 areas. They were all firing out the backs at these guys here, which allowed them then, as this squad here, broken in 2, was watching the roof, allowed them to move somewhat more freely as the tanks stopped firing at shells, allowing for them to leave, as they coordinated everything by radio and ISR assets with drones monitoring everything. This squad bounded here, stopped to watch the roofs, while this one bounded this way and went in here. And then this one bounded 5 men watching the roof while 5 ran, and then the 5 here stopped before going in to allow the other 5 to run in, and then they went in. With this one coming out, performing a similar maneuver, after they had wasted all these guys here, because when these guys in this little corner had tried to fire at these guys, they cut them down. And that's why this little green markers on this side of this arrow here. There were guys on the roofs that were firing down too, but they were eventually, they had run with this group here as they were starting to take fire from over here and from the machine gunners firing up at them, causing them to try to get further, because this was one floor higher, only one floor higher than this building here. If they figured that if they could get further into the middle of this roof, then they couldn't be fired at by either the troops on this building or by the machine gunners who could hit them on the edge of it. So they began to move in here, but by the time this squad went in to clear this building along with this other squad already inside clearing it, one squad would come up from the roof access and would cut these guys down. As this arrow indicates, they kicked open this door to this roof access, came out, and just cut these guys down. These guys were already KIA'd by the troops over here, like mentioned earlier, as they tried to get away from the ledge, but they couldn't get far enough in, and they were cut down. The situation over here, as they were entering these buildings, they had taken fire going in, as indicated by the green on the edge of the arrow. But the arrows aren't completely surrounded, so these whole squads weren't KIA'd or anything. There were actually no Chinese KIAs in this actual battle occurring in this two-pocket area. There was only WIAs. So they cleared this building, WIAs and a lost tank to Molotov attacks, but the crew got out and get into these two other neighboring tanks. They entered the buildings taking fire, but they had methodically gone through room by room, clearing it of all 40 of the armed civilians hiding all throughout these apartments in this multi-story apartment building here, just like this one over here. They cleared out all the apartments before entering the roof access and clearing the roof of any survivors, such as up here, these 3 up here. They cleared the roof of the survivors, and this pocket here was completely eliminated. This pocket of almost 200 armed American reactionary civilians was eliminated. And at the exact same time as that was even happening, the fighting down here essentially amounted to this, as this group had been cut down, and the fighting, these buildings were being shelled exactly the same time as all of this was happening. All of this was happening as well. This group of 20 in this parking lot that were running around frantically, as there were more armored forces off the map, as well as armored infantry that were also surrounding this larger pocket of armed civilians. This 20 here had been cut down by heavy machine gun and coax machine gun and a frag T shell fired in this area from one of the tanks. And these buildings are being badly shelled as well by tank gunfire. All in all, there were 100 in just this portion of the 400 armed civilian pocket, this part that's visual on this segment of the map of the larger battle occurring. This is just a map segment. This just being a 1 mile by 1 mile map in terms of total scale. This is half a mile. This is another half mile. And this is a half a mile, and this is a half a mile. These 100 that are visible on this portion of this larger pocket was 100 in total number, and they were eliminated by the sheer volume of tank shell fire, heavy machine gun fire. Even some anti-tank guided missiles were fired into these buildings from the tanks, because these tanks could fire anti-tank guided missiles, and they each carried a few in each tank, so they would fire a few of these as well. And as that was going on, as these squads of this third combat platoon, as there were 3 combat platoons and the headquarters platoon that formed this armored infantry company here, with this full tank company with its 4th platoon guarding this bridge. These squads of this 3rd combat platoon, with the other 2 platoons having reduced this pocket and eliminated it, they cleared these buildings on this block and went into the hospital to clear it. They ignored all the unarmed civilians that were still left in this area, especially the hospital patients. And as these 2 rolling T formations of 2 squads went down the street, they bounded behind this tank. This one bounded behind this tank, then went this way behind this tank, and then they did it 5-man bounds. They had 5 bound ahead as 5 watched this building, and then this 5 would watch the building, and the other 5 would bound to reform the squad, and then they went into the hospital from this end. This squad went up to the top floor of the hospital and set up on the roof to provide overwatch of this entire area. And this squad cleared this building and went over into this building, which was a commercial building, a large business, and they went up to the roof access, and then they provided overwatch over here. And this squad clearing the building went in and cleared the bottom floors. Both squads went into this building at the same time. And after the squad clearing the bottom floors was finished, they bounded behind this tank to take up position behind it to provide infantry support to their armor in the area. And essentially, with the other forces off map also helping to surround the even larger pocket, the full additional armored infantry company with 1 platoon from this armored infantry company also assisting in this, and the full tank company as well, with part of it shown, 1 full platoon as well as 3 tanks from another platoon shown also around this area, and the anti-tank platoon off map firing in support against this pocket to reduce buildings where there were armed civilians hiding, and the headquarters company off map coordinating the logistics and commanding the operation. This entire operation ended at about 25 minutes after 2 a.m. So about 2:25 from just before 2 a.m., about a quarter before, after the first hour and 45 minutes had been spent basically herding these armed civilians into these 2 pockets. The operation to completely seize total control over the city of Temple had concluded. And now, this segment of I-35 had been totally secure, as in I-35 adjacent to both the installation and the cities that ran along it. This segment of highway was now 100% secure by the elements of the 68th PLA Group Army tasked with securing this area. And now, all efforts would be focused on preventing any escaping armed American Army units from getting anywhere near I-35, while the rest of the installation was being reduced to absolute rubble. As again, this took the highest priority, obviously, during this battle, but armed civilian bands that could potentially become partisan or also called guerrilla forces against the supply and administrative or command vehicles, which were lightly armored when compared with the much, much heavier and more powerful combat vehicles of the enormous convoy operation that was set to come through in a matter of hours from the external invasion prong, Group Armies 7 through 13. None of these vehicles could risk being destroyed, as urban areas had more hiding places for guerrilla forces to ambush weak vehicles from, with things like Molotov cocktails or implements like that. And that couldn't be risked at all, as even for one vehicle, once again, to be damaged would throw a wrench into the timetable, as these vehicles would have to be cleared and removed out of the way for the rest of the convoy to proceed. And the convoy was operating on a strict timetable, with all these group armies needing to be able to travel up I-35 as smoothly and rapidly as possible to get to where they were ultimately going to fan back out into combat formations out of their convoying formations. Indeed, it was the case that en route, as they got deeper inland, they would shed different group armies into different areas, but at least in this portion of the convoy operation, they would not be far enough inland yet to where they were to begin the shedding process of allowing different group armies to shed off of the larger convoy to begin to assist Trojans that were deeper inland. They needed to get as deep as northern Oklahoma and Kansas before they would start to shed group armies and break out of their convoy formations and back into actual combat formations to assist the Trojans that were already deep inland doing the heavy lifting as their heavy-handed reinforcements. As such was the case, it was left to the local Trojans to secure the route of advance for the externals, as well as to provide them their supply installations, which were run by Trojan units, to refuel and conduct any needed maintenance operations, as well as to rearm and replenish ammunition, food, water for the externals as they traveled on their journey. As it was anticipated for the entire invasion prong of the Group Armies 7 through 13 to make it to Kansas by 48 hours' time, as that was the original plan, they would actually make it with 2 hours to spare in 46 hours. And all of this would occur due to the flawless operations being carried out by all the Trojan shock armies, not just throughout the land, but specifically those that were responsible for segments of I-35, such as here being perhaps the most vital segment of all due to the proximity of Fort Hood to it, as the sheer weight of American firepower just concentrated here, being so close to I-35, would have been the only major road bump to Group Armies 7 through 13 insofar as potentially providing a requirement to have to exit the highway, engage them, and get back on had it not been for the Trojans already handling them. In other words, it would have taken time out of their timetable to have to get off the highway, fight the American forces, get back on the highway, replenish everything, and then get moving again. And due to the fact that fourth generation warfare, the Trojans being the main component of it, the leading component of it, with the externals taking a back seat, mainly being their reinforcements, the Trojans made it possible for the externals to travel so far in such a rapid amount of time because they were the ones engaging the troops of Fort Hood, and it didn't have to be up to the externals to do such, as they could continue traveling unimpeded to get as deep inland as fast as possible, as their main battles were fought at the border, and everything else would be fought much deeper inland, and by the time they would get there, the Trojans would already have everything mostly wrapped up anyhow. In the next video of the hypothetical fourth generation warfare invasion documentary series, the Hood Army Airfield in eastern Fort Hood is being air assaulted by the PLAAF helicopters carrying two companies of the Falcon Special Operations Battalion into battle there, with heavy artillery support, air defense artillery support in the form of local SP AAA 95 air defense companies of this 112th Combined Arms Brigade's Air Defense Battalion being very close to the airfield. The heavy artillery support coming from the elements of the 203rd Field Artillery Brigade of the 68th Group Army, and, of course, the Special Operations Forces and the PLAAF assets landing to capture the airfield in conjunction with all the artillery, the missile strikes, and the air defense support.